From garage sales to thrift store aisles, we hunt for treasure, stacking them in piles. Hustling hard, making deals all day, flipping finds, turning profit our way. Your Hustle Podcast guides our quest, learning tricks to be the best. On eBay we make our name, reselling dreams, winning the game. Your Hustle Podcast guides our quest, learning tricks to be the best. On eBay we make our name, reselling dreams, winning the game.
Welcome to Pure Hustle Podcast. I'm Mike.
And this is Orlando, and we're on episode 441, a themed episode.
That's right. This is a themed episode, and this is our second episode now that Orlando, you are now in a new location. And so if anybody missed that, go and check out our last update episode where we kind of talked about that whole thing. But man, this podcast has gone through a lot of changes over the last 441 episodes. But one thing has not changed, and that's the importance of numbers. And today we're going to be talking about the numbers that really matter in reselling, what we need to be paying attention to, how we need to be paying attention to them, how we need to make adjustments where necessary, because the reality is it's a business and it is a numbers game. So we're going to be talking about numbers today.
Now, before we get started, I would say, like, if we combine our two screens on StreamYard here, it could look like we're in the same room right now.
Yeah. Maybe I need to get some better editing software, and we could we could do that, or we're actually in the same room together. That'd be great.
And by the way, all of you that are listening on the podcast, and you're like, why are they dropping episodes on Thursday? It's my fault. I got to tell you, I have 60 to 80 totes. I got 60, 80 boxes. I've been trying to unpack. I've been trying to, just do all the normal stuff of moving, and it's kind of delayed us. So my intention is next week, Wednesday, we'll start going live on time as previously scheduled. And eventually we'll start doing their normal podcasts and the Monday lives and all that good stuff in time. But so talking about numbers. So I'm not a big fan about talking about numbers, but it's really important. It really is important. I mean, if especially if you want to make decent money.
Yeah, I mean, it really is everything. And, I mentioned when we had Tim the Slim on, he made that comment about, whatever gets tracked gets improved. We know that, like, in the teaching field. And then the reality is that kind of goes with every aspect of life, is like whatever you track, that's where growth is going to happen. If you're not tracking it, you might have some accidental growth, but you're not going to have measurable growth consistently over time. The same thing is true whether it comes to fitness and working out. I mean, I heard years ago on like a TikTok type thing, and it really stuck with me. Good old TikTok. One of those ideas of like, hey, when it comes to weight loss, one of the things people don't realize is they only weigh themselves like, once in a blue moon. It's like every so often it's like, oh, let's see what I weigh. They get on the scale. And then they say like, oh, I don't want to weigh myself every day because I'm trying to lose weight. But the reality is one of the best ways to actually make sure you can maintain like a healthy weight is to weigh yourself every single day. Because there might be some fluctuations here and there. But if you're like, hey, I've noticed over the last week, I kind of took off because of Christmas time. I've gone up 4 pounds. All right, now I need to kind of put on the metal again, because go pedal to the metal, because you can lose 5 pounds easy. 4 pounds, 5 pounds easy. But if you only get on the scale a couple times a year, you're like, oh, where did that 20 pounds come from? And now you got a big thing to worry about. It's a lot harder to lose 20 pounds. And it's the same thing with reselling. Like if you are keeping track of your numbers, you can really quickly see, hey, over the last week, the last 2 weeks, numbers have dipped here, numbers have grown here. You can make micro adjustments, and it's never like a big change that has to happen. You can just make micro adjustments as necessary to make sure that you're staying profitable and you're continuing to grow.
Oh, so true. So the first one is, and this is going to be basically reselling 101. Some of you that are listening are going to be like, okay, why are we talking about this? But I think especially if you're new, you kind of aren't aware of some of these things, and you need to be aware because it can catch up to you over time. And it's this whole idea of your profit margin. I know it sounds very basic, but I would say the number one rule in reselling is to buy low and sell high. Because if you buy low and sell high, there's a lot you can do with that, right? You can end up selling at a competitive price. You can have some room when you negotiate. You are able to take the losses when you end up getting returns and so on. But the key thing is understanding gross versus net. This is why Mike and I, in 441 episodes, have never flexed our 98 numbers. Now, I will say a lot of that is because sometimes there wasn't a time to flex. But I will say there were times I could have flexed 90-day numbers, but it doesn't mean anything, right? Because 90-day numbers, even still, even though right now they have removed like returns and some other numbers, you truly never really know what people are making, right? Because you could have a 90-day total of like $100,000, but if your inventory costs you $90,000 and your shipping costs you $7,000, you're only making $3,000 over the 3 months. So you got to be really aware. And I would say if you're brand new, make sure you're tracking that, because you don't want to be putting a ton of work. Like, you might have a sale that's $50 and you're like, yes, that's awesome. But you may have picked up the item for $30. Then when you include fees, then when you include shipping, you only made like $5. So you went out there, you spent all this time sourcing, you spent this gas, you spent all these different expenses, and in the end, your profit margin was not worth it. And I think a lot of people aren't aware of that. I would say in the beginning, when I was going full time, I was not really aware. I'll never forget that, and we'll talk about this later on, that like my promoted listings took off. My cost of goods had taken off because I was like, oh, I'm full time. I can buy as much as I want because I have the time to list. And in the end, it ended up hurting me pretty bad. So you got to be careful about calculating your profit.
Yeah, you really need to know what that net number is, because that's going to be the key. And kind of jumping down to this third point we have here for the profit margins, because you already touched on a little bit this idea of you got to factor in all the costs, right? Cost of goods. What did you actually spend on the items? And that's why, using something like My Reseller Genie or spreadsheets or things can be very helpful. You need this information anyways for taxes. So you want to kind of keep that in the forefront when you're doing your tallying what you're doing as you go, because then you can make those adjustments and know what your real numbers are. But things like cost of goods, the gas, time spent, processing the items, sourcing the items, listing the items, all of those things matter. And one of the things like I know a lot of people get stuck in, I've seen this with like my dad was really big into like the Uber driving for a while. And a lot of times people only factor in a handful of things. They're like, oh yeah, I made X amount tonight. And it's like, okay, that's great, but like, let's start figuring out your costs. Like, well, I only spent $40 in gas or $30 in gas. It's like, okay, well, that is, you're factoring in some of the expenses now. But what a lot of people aren't realizing, especially with things like Uber, and the same thing is true for us as resellers, you're driving around places, okay, it's more than just the gas costs. I mean, there's a reason you get a pretty decent tax write-off per mile. And the reason you get that is because you're going to have to change that timing belt and the oil and the tires and the brakes, and all of those things on your car start to add up really quickly. And it's impossible to really to account for every single one of those things. Like, well, this is how much wear and tear on my timing belt or my water pump on my car I'm putting in on this. You can't factor into that level. But you can even use something like, hey, if the IRS is giving me 70 some cents per mile, I can kind of think of that not as just like, hey, I'm getting this money potentially back at the end of the year when I'm doing my taxes, or it's helping me not have to pay as much taxes, but recognizing I've potentially done close to that amount of damage on my car over that period of time. And so you kind of got to be thinking about all of these things when you're figuring out your net profit. And so, that's why I'm a big fan of things like spreadsheets, is because you can keep track and see in one easy place, or something like My Reseller Genie, like how many miles have I done? What is the potential cost on that? And so when I do have to get new cars or new tires for my car, I'm factoring that into, okay, if I use my car 70% for business this year, and I had to pay $600 for tires, well, that's an expense now that's cutting into this, not just the 90-day total, but my year profit from the business. And if you don't know that, you can just be thinking, oh, this is how much I made this year. But it's like, well, you actually had to spend in a lot of other places.
Yeah, and I know that's to some listening, because even to me, like hearing what Mike's saying sounds kind of extreme, but it is true. It is true, right? If you're driving, let's say you're driving a source 4 hours on a Saturday morning, and you're putting in, I mean, I've put in 200 to 300 miles sourcing garage sales. I've put in thousands of miles sourcing retail arbitrage, and you're only picking up so many items, right? You're only making so much profit. Let's say you go garage sales for 4 hours, and you only pick up enough items to make like $200. It may not be worth it, right? Depending on how long it takes you to list the items, depending on the shipping, depending on the supplies. And another thing, you got to think about the processing, right? And Mike and I, one of the things we do not pick up anymore are dual deck VCRs or DVD recorders. It's crazy. On my move, I gave away probably like 30 to 40 of them. Somebody ended up hitting the mother load. Now, none of them were tested, so I don't know. I hope he's still my friend because I am pretty sure they all worked, but I don't know. But here's the thing. Back in the day, you used to be able to get like $200 for those. And for me, picking up for $5 or $10 and then spending the 20 minutes it took to test those items, because you had, like, if you had a DVD recorder, you had to like play the VHS, you had to play the DVD, then you had to find a VHS, then you had to record the VHS on a blank DVD disc, and then you had to possibly test the recording, something that's on a screen on a DVD disc, testing the remote. Like, that took you 20 to 30 minutes. And then on top of that, when you ship it, it was also a pain because it's not like you put in a priority flat rate box. You had to get a certain box and you had to make sure you bubble wrapped it and you bubble wrapped the corners. And so after it's all said and done, right, you're talking about maybe an hour and a half to process that one item. And I know some people will be like, I do it in 10. That's fine. If you can do it in 10, good for you. But, let's say on average you spend an hour and your profit margin on that is like $20. Are you better off picking up, let's say, a vintage Ralph Lauren? Are you better off picking up some shoes that have higher margins than picking up that DVD VCR player? Because, yes, you might have gotten it cheap, but the amount of time you spend on it is not worth your time. So these are things you need to think about when you're thinking about numbers in reselling. Now, shipping. Shipping is the one that I think a lot of people don't think about, especially, Mike, how often do you free ship anymore?
I do free shipping occasionally. A lot of times I do like a flat rate fee just because I've done this long enough now. I pretty much know what something's going to cost to ship. Now I have and still do free shipping to an extent, but it's one of those things where it's a game you're playing, right? No matter what, if you're doing free shipping, you're going to have to increase the cost of your goods, or if you're doing calculated shipping, you really don't know. You could be closing yourself off to some markets because, it's showing up a higher rate, maybe even than you could actually potentially get them if you're using, discounts and stuff. So it's really tough with free shipping because I don't think a lot of people, I mean, the longer you do this, the easier it is to kind of recognize, like, hey, I could sell this item. I'm selling it for $20. I'm going to do free shipping. I know it's going to cost me $4 to ship this, item in a poly bag based off of its weight. No big deal. I know in my head it's $16 that I'm making plus the cost of goods, and you do that math pretty quickly on your own. But you do have to factor that in when it comes to something, because nothing is free, right? Like if it's free shipping, that just means you're taking some of your profit and paying for the shipping, which means, there's a lot of times it's a net even for a customer. Like, a customer might see something, there's the psychological aspect to it. Like, a customer might see something for $20 with free shipping, and then something else for $16 with $4 shipping, and they see free shipping. And so some people psychologically are like, well, I'm going to go with the one with free shipping. But a lot of times it ends up equaling out, so you're looking at trying to be competitive. And so sometimes if you're going to be the exact same price as your competitor, maybe offering free shipping with a little bit higher price, the total net, maybe that helps you out there. But otherwise, you really got to pay attention to that, because it could certainly cut in. I mean, even with me doing not free shipping, but doing the flat rate and knowing, like, hey, I'm going to just charge $4 to ship this. And more than half of the time, it's going to come in a little under $4. And every once in a while, it's like, man, this is going somewhere and I'm going to have to pay $6 for this. Right. And so you end up paying a couple dollars more, but I know it evens out, and I'm still over time making money on my shipping or breaking even on my shipping. But yeah, you got to be careful with that. Trying to be competitive, free shipping is one of those areas you got to be careful with.
And we've also talked about this before. It kind of ties into what we were talking about earlier. Like, when you source an item, right, and you think, hey, I'm going to make like a lot of good money on this, you got to think about two things. Number one, is the shipping going to be a detriment to you being able to sell that item? Right? Is the shipping going to be, like, if you're selling smaller items, like, is your shipping going to cost more? I had somebody actually yesterday go, Rolando, I've recently been trying to sell on eBay, and why do people charge more for shipping an item than the item itself? And, well, there's two reasons. One is some people think they can make money on shipping and that people will go for the lower price. I don't know if that's effective. But the other one is, the reality is the shipping actually does cost more than the item. And chances that people are going to buy the item are pretty slim when it's that case. And you also got to think about, when you source an item, like dimensional weight, right? Or, what carrier are you going to use? Like, and are you comfortable? And then on top of that, how much time are you going to spend packing that item? Again, I want to reiterate that, like, just because you got a deal, it still may not be worth the time. I can't tell you how many times. I would say anything that is less than $50 and will take me 30 minutes to pack, or more than 30 minutes, I just won't pick up. It's just not worth it. It's a lot of work, material, and time. But yeah, you got to be aware with your shipping, because if you're not careful with your shipping, especially as the shipping prices continue to go up, you can get really lost. I think a priority right now, I used to use the medium flat rate a lot, and medium flat rate's like $15.80 now, sometimes $16 depending on what part of the country. And if you're only charging $9.99, you're losing like $6 on each shipment, and so you got to make sure your profit margin's good. If that's the case, it'll work. But if it's not, you could be losing a ton of money on shipping, and in the end, it's just not worth it to pick up certain items.
Yeah, I mean, even thinking about things like that, like not just dimensional weight for pricing and that type of stuff, or like the regional rates for items, but even just thinking of when you're buying an item, and I think good resellers do this naturally, but I can't tell you how many times I get sucked into like, man, this is a really good item at this thrift store, but I know I don't have any boxes that'll fit this, and it's going to require a little bit of additional like packing, and so I'm gonna have to Frankenstein this item. And so even if like the comps show like, hey, it looks like people are getting $40 or $50 shipping on this, so it's reasonable to assume I can do the same. But now I'm still going to have to go out and drive and find the boxes for this and get the extra foam and the things, because I don't have on hand the items I'm going to need. And so thinking about those things of like, what is the cost for me? Not just because remember how you used to buy things online and it was always shipping and handling. Right. It was like, or not online, even just like, yeah, it's like the handling aspect. And it's like, there is a part of that makes sense of like, hey, handling this item for me is going to be a little bit more. It's even if you're covering the cost of shipping, the fact that I have to go get special things to make sure that this gets to you. Now, if I'm always selling things this size, this shape, this dimension, but that's another reason you want to keep those numbers of dimensions in mind, is do you have the boxes on hand for that? Are you able to buy them in bulk? Because if you can buy, hey, I'm going to buy 100 boxes of this size because I'm always shipping these types of items, you're going to get a better price on it. If you're buying a one-off at Walmart because I've got to ship this out today and this is the only place I can go to get this box, you're paying a premium on it. So you want to be keeping those thoughts in mind as well.
Agreed. Now, it's interesting here because this next one, like, I don't know, it's one of those things I've always said you got to be careful, and I will say promoted listings has completely taken advantage of me. Like it ends up killing my profit margins, but I'm okay with it. And the reason I'm okay with it, especially now that I'm part-time, is I may not be listing all the time. I may not be, sourcing all the time. So sometimes the promoted listings ends up helping me out. And by the way, I know there's people that are watching us right now live. If you ever have a question or you want to comment, feel free to leave us a comment or a question. We'd love to answer those questions for you. But eBay ads, you got to really be careful with those numbers. There's the initial eBay, standard ad, right? Are you hearing a little bit of an echo, Mike? I'm hearing myself. Are you good?
Nope, you're good.
Okay. It's just me. It's all in my head. All right. So you got to be careful, because if you end up with a dynamic ad rate on promoted listings, so that's where you remove the cap and you let eBay decide where your ad should be, your ad rate should be. You could end up doing like 20%, 30% on certain items, right? And if your profit margin was low already, right, and you already have eBay fees and you're not careful, you could be going like you have, like, let's say, I'll give you an example. I remember one time I looked at my numbers and I had $10,000 in gross sales, and I was like, oh, that's great, great month. And I probably only spent, I don't know, maybe a few hundred for all the items. But then when I looked at how much I actually made net, I made like $5,600. That means $4,400 of my items was either being eaten up by shipping or eBay fees or promoted listings. And I think when I looked at it, it was about a third of my fees was promoted listings. It's a lot. That's a lot. Now, for me, it wasn't that big of a deal because, again, my cost of goods was low. But if that ends up being something that, like, your cost of goods is high, and on top of that, okay, you end up, spending a lot of time packing and shipping and all that, it may not be worth it to you. But to me, it is. But you gotta be aware of that. And then the other one, there's the pay-per-click. That's the advanced ads, and I know some people have tried that. But again, that's even worse, because if you're not careful and you have an item that's not hot, people don't want to buy it, but they just they're just people that want to look at it, and they keep clicking and you don't convert, like it's just not worth it to you. So you got to determine if it's worth it to you. Again, we shared this in a couple podcasts ago. Let your item sell, not the promoted listings do the selling, right? If you pick up good items, and we'll talk about this later on, with great sell rate, like you may not need promoted listings, but be warned that once you go promoted listings, you can't turn back the clock.
Yep. No, that's good. You want to jump into? I'm getting excited for our next one here. I'm getting a banner ready for it. So if you want to do our little my reseller thing, and then we'll jump into that.
Right. Okay. Before we do that, though, I do want to thank Reality Smacks. Says I always look forward to the podcast straight to the point. Hey, thanks so much. It's funny because sometimes we get reviews that say that we're not to the point. So I always appreciate people when they come in and let us know. Thanks so much, Reality Smacks. Hey, my reseller genie. So talking about numbers. It's almost tax time. It's March. April 15 will be here soon. And if you're stressing about your taxes, you can use my reseller genie. We still got to announce the winner. Okay, we're going to announce the winner next week for January, and then for February. And now you can leave comments, and we will announce in April the winner for March. So just give you a heads up. It's not over yet. But if you're like, hey, I don't know if I'm going to win, I don't want to wait, you can get 15% off the first month of my reseller genie. My reseller genie is software that is made by resellers for resellers. It'll allow you to import all your stuff from eBay, your shipping, your cost of not your cost of goods, but your promoted listing fees and any other fees you have. But you can also add cost of goods because you're able to put inventory out there and you're able to say how much you paid for it. And in the end, when you sell it, you're able to use all those numbers and hand it over to your tax person. So if you haven't checked out my reseller genie, jump on over and use our code Pure Hustle. You'll get 15% off the first month. And again, that's our code Pure Hustle. You can get 15% off the first month. All right. Are you telling me you're getting excited about custom SKU labels?
Yeah, man. When we first somebody brought up, I think it was early on in the podcast, maybe in that first year or so, somebody mentioned the idea of custom SKUs. And since then, I've been using it for a lot of things. And so when we first figured out about how to use custom SKU numbers on eBay, when you make a listing, was simply just to put like what bin it's in, right? Like it's in bin A2 or A4 and whatever numbering system you have for that. But over time, I've kind of adapted my custom SKU system to include a lot of information that's very useful. Because we've had people say things like, when you do the end and sell similar, how do you know like which items, like when you listed items, like you can kind of forget what's what. And I've given some examples of ways to like, do the most recent listed and then go down and then 10%. And I've talked about all of those strategies, but here's a good way to just kind of always keep track of your items. And so here's what I use. This is, and I give an example here. So I do the bin number, right? So in the example, it's like A1. Then the purchase date of the item or the list date of the item, either way. A lot of times it's going to be list date, especially if you're going through something on a death pile, right? You might have bought it 2 years ago. You're just listing it now, but you want to know like how long has this been active on eBay? Because I'm ending and selling similar a lot. So I always do year, month, day. And the reason I do that is because it's easy to sort like things from years that way. It works out. This is just a better numbering system than doing normally day, month, year. So anyways, like this would be an example of an item that got listed on March 5th of 2025. And then the last one is the price point. So I usually have 3 digits there. Usually I'm not buying things for more than 3 digits. So for this would be a $12 item. So I paid $12 for this. I know what that means. I know when I listed it. I know where to find it. So that's my custom SKU kind of system. And it makes it really easy because when an item sells, maybe I've ended and sell similar multiple times on this. So it might only look like it's been up for 20 days, 25 days, but I know it's been there longer. So this is a way for me to know when did I actually list this item? And then when I'm doing things like running sales, I can quickly find like, well, do I have anything still from 2023? Right? Like those are the items that I really need to push on. Yeah. Okay. Now I've gone through all my 2023 items. Now let me find all my items that are 2025. And then same thing with my price point. Like, okay, like now I know my wiggle room on an item. If I'm like, hey, I listed this for $100 and it's not selling. Okay, well, I paid 12. So that gives me an idea because that might have been a year ago that I bought that. So I might have forgot what my initial price was. So now I know what I'm actually going to be able to do on this. Nice thing with this too is it makes it really easy when items sell to know what that price was and then use that for your taxes as well.
No, that's good. And listen, if you want to just do basic and just locate where it's at, just do that. Start somewhere, right? Because Mike's system is really good. There's a lot of some, But if you're just like, oh man, it's a lot to think through, just here's the thing: if you can locate your item, you're gonna be making money because I've had it before. And right now, in the midst of my moving, you know what's been awesome is that despite the fact that I have all these totes and there's all this stuff in the garage and in the storage and all that, the fact that I have custom SKUs allows me to easily find items still. That in the midst of all the chaos, I can still find items. And you never want to be in a place where you're spending an hour and a half, 2 hours just for one item. And think about that, cuts into your profit, right? If you're only gonna make $20 on an item, you could have spent the hour and a half, 2 hours listing, 6, 10, 12 items that could have made you $300 to $400, $500. But instead, you're busy looking for an item that only made you $20 net profit. So you got to be aware of those custom SKUs. And so, are you ready to talk about some great scores here, Mike?
Yeah, these are even more exciting than custom SKUs because we're going to be talking about our hustles of the week.
Come on, hustlers. It's the freaking hustle of the week.
Yeah. All right. So our first hustle of the week. Oh man, second shout out of the day. Tim the Slim from the Discord paid a couple of bucks at the first church sale of the season. Listed a vintage Patagonia nylon patula jacket and sold overnight.
Pataloha.
Yep, that's what I said. Jacket and sold overnight to a buyer in Japan on eBay for $356 plus shipping. Holy smokes, man! That buyer in Japan really wanted that Patagonia jacket. That's pretty amazing. $356, and because that plus ship for that Japanese buyer. That was a hefty shipping cost. That was not small.
The interesting thing about it is in Discord, there's discussion that's probably going to sell for double in Japan because how big vintage is out there. And it is. I've seen people like try to go thrifting, and we talk about thrift prices here. It's crazy out there in Japan.
It's really weird though, thinking about coming from Japan because I talked to a guy who used to be stationed in Japan, and he sold on eBay. And the way he did it was, he says in Japan a lot of times people have very smaller houses, like they live in the city, so they live in like 1-bedroom studios, but they're pretty wealthy nation. They're doing well, or at least the areas that he was at. So what people will do is they will buy a bunch of stuff for their house, and then like in a year they're like tired of all their stuff, so they sell it all and then buy new stuff. So they're constantly like redoing their small, and they can do that because they've got such a small space, but they always want to kind of like refresh it. And so there were companies there that he was able to find that would kind of lot up all these items, then ship them over to the US. So it's kind of funny to think that there are people who are basically buying all the excess from Japan. And then, like you said, since vintage is big over there, there's people buying from the US to sell over in Japan. So it's a kind of a funny swap that's happening there.
I know, it's very, very, very true. And this jacket, it's in our Discord, and we'll talk about how to access our Discord. But it's interesting because I would have never picked it up, because usually when you think of Pataloha, you think of like Hawaiian shirts, right? The Patagonia version of Hawaiian shirts. But the Hawaiian pattern was inside the jacket. So you could never really tell that it was Pataloha unless you saw the Patagonia tag. So that was a great score. Tim the Slim, $2 at a church sale. All right, this next one comes from Calvin from Discord. Picked up 48 brand new circuit breakers from a liquidation sale yesterday afternoon for $415. I priced them lower than the market to sell fast in lots of 8. Sold 32 of 48 in those 8X lots, and the rest are posted individually. Net $340 profit so far, and 16 more to sell. That's great. Also said, I'm going through old podcasts at the moment, and funny enough, heard a bolo for circuit breakers on an old episode about 5 minutes after I posted them yesterday. I absolutely could have priced these higher, but in this case, it was more appealing to price out the market and go for a quick turnaround. And I agree. So circuit breakers, like those are tough to move. So at least in my experience, they are. So if you price them right and you made that profit back, it's a very nice turnaround. So nice work there.
Fantastic. All right, our next one's a Gmail. I'm excited that we're getting some Gmail ones. So this one says, it's from Alex on Gmail. It says, hey, Mike and Orlando, file this under trust your instincts. Back in December, I responded to a Facebook marketplace listing for a guy selling what appeared from the photos to be a large amount of different wargaming miniatures, a niche that is my focus on my eBay store and always has me hunting for interesting local deals. After some back and forth, he explained it was a collection he had inherited and that he was eager to let go of. He knew it was worth a good deal of money, but he was getting so sick of people wanting to come and pick through piece by piece that he was desperate for someone who would take it all, and was only willing to sell to someone who would clear it all out of the storage unit that it was in. He told me it was roughly a 20-inch by 27-inch gallon plastic tote full of stuff.
27-gallon totes.
Okay. Oh my gosh. 27-gallon
Yes,
plastic totes.
That's a big difference.
Oh my! I like my heart is racing right now. Plastic totes full of stuff, most of which he hadn't even gone through. Although it was nearly a 3-hour drive from Boston, where I'm located, up to the middle of nowhere, Vermont, my instincts were telling me that this was going to be worth it. And at worst, it would be a fun adventure and a decent story. I rented a U-Haul cargo van that day and hit the road. I ended up getting stuck in a snowstorm en route and having no choice but to spend the night at a random hotel along the way. I made it to him early the next morning, and there was so much stuff in the storage unit, it filled up every last inch of the U-Haul. 90% of the boxes and totes, I didn't even look inside as I put them in the van. I paid him his asking price of $1,500 cash. Oh my gosh, this is crazy. And turned right around and brought it all home with the van practically touching the ground from the weight of it all. When I got home and began to go through everything, I realized that I'd hit the mother lode, full of beautifully painted miniatures from tons of different games, including Warhammer, Dust Tactics, and Flames of War, and many of the pieces I was pulling were rare and out of production. My total cost, including the U-Haul, the purchase cost, and the hotel for the night, came to $2,088. See, got to include it all in there. 3 months into selling through this collection via my eBay store, I've done over $18,000 in sales as of tonight. I'm sitting on a profit of $14,934 after all my costs. I still have about 20% of the collection left to go through, and I realize that I might never get so fortunate again. So take nothing for granted and have been grateful for the ride, and that I follow my instinct through the snowstorm. And it did indeed turn out to be a great story. Thanks for all you guys do, Alex. Well, Alex, thank you so much. I mean, we've talked, at least I've talked quite a bit about some wargaming and wargaming miniatures. In fact, I've got a piece right now that I'm working on painting. So there's money to be made there, right? Like there's definitely money to be made, and you don't, like you said, like you may never get a deal like that again, because that's the kind of stuff that doesn't show up every day. That's an incredible sale. But the fact that you were willing to do what it took, you rented a van, you drove, you got a motel room, you filled up the van, you dropped $1,500, right? Like that's a lot of stuff that a lot of people wouldn't be willing to do, especially because it's a 3-hour drive. Like you, if you're wrong and you just wasted 6 hours plus a U-Haul. So yeah, a lot of times you got to strike when the iron is hot. What an incredible deal, Alex.
Oh, I miss those kind of hauls. Like, and by the way, I want to let Alex know that may feel like that's the once in a lifetime haul, but there will be many others. That's the beauty of reselling. Like every time I've scored something huge, I'm like, there's no way I'll be able to do better than this. And sure enough, I end up getting a bigger haul. So nice work there, Alex. Hey, before we move on to the hustle of the week that Mike and I have, I do want to invite everybody to social media. You can follow us on all platforms as Pure Hustle Podcast. We are Pure Hustle Cast on Twitter. If you ever want to send in a hustle of the week or a question, you can send us like a voicemail via Gmail. Go to purehustlepodcast@gmail.com. That's purehustlepodcast@gmail.com. And as always, grateful for all of you that tune into the podcast faithfully. And if you haven't jumped on over, really would love you to jump on over and hit that subscribe button, smash that like button, and hit that bell notification so you're notified of any new episodes when they drop. Always grateful for everyone. But, you know, it's just one of those things where we're almost at 10K subscribers, and a lot of doors will begin to open with 10K subscribers. So hoping that will happen soon. And I just want to share the iTunes reviews. So I always encourage everyone to jump on over. We're still at 4.8. I want to get us back to 4.9 on our Apple iTunes reviews. But jumping over to iTunes reviews, leave us those 5 stars and tell us why you love the podcast. So I'm going to share a few reviews here. The first one comes from Lafayette 11. Maybe I read this one. I don't know. Already this is back in January. Said I started listening to the show when I first started reselling over a year ago. These guys are consistent, seem like nice people, and I always learn a thing or two each podcast. Thank you for your time and working on this show. Well, appreciate that. I'm glad people think we're nice, because not everyone does. This comes from the CDC, says the best and most informative reselling podcast available. This one comes from Lolo Livy. That was something we talked about last week. But by the way, you did get your response. I don't know. Did you shoot us an email? They said they wanted to respond to one of the questions about taking a risk that paid off on an episode. Hey, shoot us that email. Okay. Lolo, Livy, we will be looking out for the email, purehustlepodcast@gmail.com. All right. Read one last one here. This comes from Calvin. Maybe it's Calvin with the hustle of the week that we shared today. It said, great podcast, valuable info. Recently discovered the Pure Hustle podcast and have been going through episodes, lots of valuable information. Thanks. Yes, we have 440. I still think it's crazy. 441 episodes. And by the way, every episode has been free. There has been no paywall. There has been no barrier to entry. And the reason being is because of all the people that support us, especially on Patreon. So if you haven't supported us yet and you want to have access to our Discord, go to patreon.com/Podcast for $5.55 a month. That's $5.55 a month. I mean, you can't even like use the McValue menu deals anymore. Like it's all gone for $5.55 a month. So check us out. You will learn so much. That $5.55 a month will seem like nothing based on all the knowledge that you'll gain by jumping into our Discord of thriving Pure Hustle Podcast resellers. So check us out. All right, Mike, what is your hustle of the week?
Oh man, hustle of the week. Okay, so we like to travel. I'm a teacher, so I get summers and lots of weeks off on vacations. So we do a little bit of traveling around the States to go visit family. And so one of the things we always try and do while we're gone and we do these travels is stop at a couple of thrift stores. I can't tell you how many times like the whole trip or a good portion of the trip gets paid for from some items we find at a thrift store. And we were stopped at a thrift store, and my wife tends to go to the female clothing and I go to like electronics and male clothing and that type of stuff. And she came and she's like, hey, I think I got something. And she had like a whole cart full of these like athletic shirts. And they kind of look like Lululemon shirts. They're not Lululemon. They were another brand. I can't remember what they were called. Some with an X. But they were on clearance for $2 a piece. And it was a whole bunch of them. And they were doing like a 50% off day on clothing. And so I was like, these are going to be $1 a piece. And they were brand new with tags, every single one of them. And they were all different sizes, everywhere from extra small up to large. And there were like maybe 3 different colors and like 2 different styles. So it was like a total of like 5 listings and then just some sizes you had to put in there. And I think we got like 30 of these. Maybe it was like 40. It was quite a bit of them. Like we got a whole bunch of these shirts, 5 listings. And we've gotten these put up and we've started to move them, right? Like my wife just sold, I say my wife because she's the one that found them, but we just sold 2 of them full asking price, the same buyer. And I think we're selling them for like $20 a piece, right? So we made $40, and that right there is almost enough, if not completely enough, to pay for everything we purchased. And so just a hustle of the week, because that's the area of the store I never really go into, just because female clothes is such it's just a niche.
There's so much out there.
There's so much, and unless you kind of already know, I feel like I have a head start in male clothing because I'm familiar with brands and I'm familiar with things, even if I don't wear them, just because I pay a little bit more attention. Same thing with like shoes. I kind of tend to stay away from the female shoes. But she found these and they were a huge score, and buying in a bulk like that. So now any of them that are selling afterwards, it's just going to be pure profit. So it was a good find for her. And then the fact that they're already starting to sell, pretty excited for.
Nice. All right, so my hustle of the week, I mentioned it on a podcast last week, but I didn't tell the whole story. But it's one of those. The reason I mentioned it is that during the move, I chose to put my store on vacation, but on vacation that meant I can still sell items, and it has been crazy. Don't get me wrong. Like there has been times I've sold an item, and I'm like, I have no idea, and I've had to open up like 20 boxes. But I got to tell you, like I'm still making money every single day on eBay. I felt like rapping, making money every day, all the totally selling on FBA. All right, anyways, if you don't know what we're talking about, check out our Q4 reseller rap on YouTube. But this painting that sold, and it was kind of scary. So give you a background, I ended up going to a house over in La Jolla in California when I was over in San Diego. And I'll never forget walking through this house. And this was somebody who's just trying to offload their stuff because they were moving and they're trying to get organized. And they had paintings in these rooms. And she's like, what do you think about that painting? And I said, oh, it looks pretty awesome, but I'm pretty sure I can't give you what you want for it. She's like, just take it down. And then I saw another one and I'm like, that's pretty cool. She's like, you like that one? I'm like, yeah. She's like, take it down. Right. I always tell people, never hurts to ask. It never hurts to ask. And sure enough, I ended up picking up like 10 paintings. And during this buy, I bought I remember I bought a paddle board. I bought like all these paintings. I bought tons of art books. I bought so much stuff, and I paid $250 for all of it. Just crazy, just crazy. And again, never underestimate when people want to move stuff. They will move stuff. Like they're willing to haggle with you. And one of the items that sold was this. It's a Michael Ott. Okay, I guess he's an artist. Cowboy and Son watercolor. It's 36 by 28, and it's already in the frame. It's a Western Rodeo shirt. And I was kind of concerned because I'm not very big on art, so I couldn't tell the difference between a lithograph or a watercolor and so on. But I love the fact that I took a picture of it and I uploaded it to AI, and I'm like, "What do you think this is?" And they're like, "Well, it's a watercolor based on the depth of the image and the signature and so on." And it was great. Remember, I paid $250 for everything. I already sold 3 of these paintings for over $1,000. I sold an Andy Warhol book for $400. I made a killing on the score. I didn't even know what I had, and this painting here sold for $585 plus ship. Wow. So I'm telling you, if you go on vacation,
how big was the painting?
The painting is 36 by 28.
Ooh, that'll be a tough ship, though, huh?
Yeah, but actually, I actually have one of those boxes here. So
Orlando has disappeared for a little bit.
I have, but can I show that? Will it
it's thinking it's part of the background. It's trying to. That's funny. You can't even show it.
Okay, but if you ever have those TV boxes, the TV boxes at U-Haul, whatever, those work wonders for painting. So what I did is I got the painting, I bubble wrapped it, and then I bubble wrapped the corners really tight. And then after you do that, make sure to put cardboard on the front of it so the glass doesn't, if it breaks, it doesn't go everywhere. And then cardboard on the back because you never know if something can punch through the back. And then after that, then I put it inside the TV box. Now, not the TV box is about 2 boxes that slide together. You just got to use one of them. You don't have to use both. You could, I guess, if you want. Depends on how much the painting's worth. But I put it in there, and then I used a bunch of packing paper, and then I taped it, and it was good to go, and it arrived safely. And make sure to insure it. Make sure to get your signature required. But yeah, I don't know, I paid maybe $10 for it, and flipping it for $585. I'll take that hustle of the week.
Love it. That's a good one.
It was a good. Hey, real quick, Bookpeller, thanks so much for telling us that you enjoy the show.
Yeah. All right, hold on. I'm going to step away. I'm going to step away for just a moment. Keep going. I'll be right back.
Okay. All right. So, hey, we're going to continue talking here. It's always awesome being solo here. But, if you're listening to the podcast, you don't even know that Mike stepped away, only if you're watching this. But about numbers. And here's what I want to say is, a lot of people miss the point about eBay fees. Now, when I talk about eBay fees, I'm not going to talk about be aware of your eBay fees. What I'm going to talk about is don't let eBay fees be a barrier to you selling. Or you get a lot of people, that claim, it's FeeBay and you can go to e-commerce bites and go in the comment section and go oh, eBay's so greedy. All they care about is how much they make on the fees. But you got to think about it. Where else? Right, you can't even go to a flea market, right? You spend maybe, I know here, or at least in San Diego, you go to Kobe's, it's like $65 to just have a parking spot for the morning, right? And that's not too hefty, but it's a decent amount of money. But think about, you're only reaching the audience of the people that go across your booth. But on eBay, right, you may be paying 10%, 12%, right? If you add the promoted listings, you may be 18%, whatever it is. But you have an audience of close to 150 million people that will come across your item if they're wanting to buy that item, right? Not only in the United States, but you should be doing eBay international shipping. So don't get caught up in the numbers and going oh man, these fees are too much. No, it is a small price to pay. I have some people that, they always do local deals, right? And local deals are great, but you're not going to get top dollar like you can on eBay. You're also going to have to deal with the fact that there's a lot of flakes. With the eBay, the beauty of it is, hey, you list the item, you wait, and when somebody wants it, they'll buy it, or you'll counter offer, or they'll offer, whatever it is. But in the end, that small fee, and it's not a tiny fee, it is a decent fee, but that fee gives you access to so many buyers. So don't get caught up in the numbers of thinking, hey, it's FeeBay and it's not worth it for me to list this item. No, you definitely should be listed on eBay regardless of the fees. Welcome back, Mike.
Thank
So,
you. Yeah, I'm assuming that was all great. That was that sounded good.
Right. Hey, transaction defects. When's the last time you got one, Mike?
It was shortly after I moved here. I had a item that sold. I was out of stock, and I couldn't get the buyer to accept a cancel, and so I had to cancel it. And it was rough. And because I had gone through such a period of time where my sales on eBay were a little low because I was trying to like lower my inventory. I wasn't listing because I was about ready to go through a big move. I mean, I'm not a full-time reseller like you, so I didn't have to keep reselling.
Well, neither am I.
That's true. That's true. I didn't have to, but I didn't rely on it as much. So I kind of I was trying to basically offload eBay and kind of like slow it down for like 6 months. And so my total number of sales, like it put me at a place where I was at risk of like losing top rated seller. I mean, I think you can get like up to 2% or something like that of your sales can be a defect. I can't remember the exact number. I was looking through them, but after you get to a certain point, it can definitely have a huge impact on your store. They actually slow down your sales if you have too many defects. But it's been over a year since I've had that kind of defect.
So, and the reason I bring it up is I do have a transaction defect now, and I'm like, oh.
Is it because you threw something away that you didn't unlist?
I don't know what happened in the move. I packed it. I thought I had it, so I was like, "Oh, I'm just gonna print the label." And then I went looking for it, and I couldn't find it. So that's a problem. So be aware of that. But now, before we move on, I do want to address what Benny said here. Benny Stratton always has great comments on our YouTube. Said the thing is, Orlando, I 100% agree with you, but most sellers pay too much for their inventory, so they have very little wiggle room regarding fees. Agreed. Again, it's about your costs, right? The lower your item costs, the more wiggle room you have. And I'm not the only one to say this. People have been saying this for years upon years, that the money that you make on an item is when you buy that item, right? The cost that you end up you end up spending that money on that cost, and then you make that money there. Secondhand Solo says we gotta address this one, Mike.
Yeah, so here's the thing. We're on the wrong sides here because I left for a moment and came back. So let me fix that real quick. I
can send a whole solo. He took that too hard. There you go.
We're back. We are back. I wanted to fix it anyways, but it's throwing me off. But I'd have to pull you out of the stream, which meant people wouldn't be able to hear you talking, and that would just be rude.
All right. So hey, I just want to talk about these transaction defects and late shipping rate. You got to be really careful with this, especially if you're part-time. So if when I was a full-time seller, I wouldn't stress off of this too much because you're selling so many items that it's very difficult. Like I know for me as a top-rated seller, like late shipping rate, like if I get more than 3% of my items at late shipping rate, like I lose top-rated seller. Like that was impossible as a full-time reseller. But if you're a new seller and you're part-time and you're only selling maybe, I don't know, 10 items a week, maybe 30 items a month. Like think about that. To get that 3%, right? That can very easily happen. So you got
just a handful of items. Yeah. The more you sell, the more wiggle room there is for a mistake. In a lot of ways, like because your numbers are so high. Now, of course, you still don't want to have like more than 2 or 3% defect rate, because if you're selling 1,000 items a week and you've got that kind of rate, like there's something wrong in your system. But it's so much easier if you sold 10 items and in a month and you messed up on one of them, right? Like now you're already at 10% defect rate. That's huge, right? So you've got to be very, very careful if you're especially if you're a part-time seller. So in a lot of ways, like it is important for everybody, but if you're a smaller seller, like those defect rates hit you at a much faster pace.
Yeah, so be very careful with those. And I would say the only solution to them, a lot of people are like, oh, I'll call eBay and all that. Chances are, it's just if you sell more, that's the easier way to go, right? You do not want to lose that top-rated seller. All right, and this other one, you got to keep an eye on. And this, I would say, has only happened maybe twice in my entire reselling career. It's cases closed without seller resolution. This number will kill you. I would say even once or twice, it will slow down your store. So you got to make sure that you get back to people right away. You got to make sure that you resolve disputes. I always tell people, like, you might have an $80 item, $100 item, and you're like, oh man, it's a lot of money. Like, I don't want to refund that. I think something shady happened. But you got to think of the long term, right? you may lose that $100. But let's say the person opens a case, let's say it ends up in dispute, and you end up losing, and it slows your store down. You will lose more than $100 because the algorithm will begin to push you down in the search. So be aware that like always work to resolve things with the buyer. Do not ignore people. I would say if it's one of those things where people are pretty upset, like you need to get back to people right away. Yes, Benny Sheridan says 100%. You do not want eBay to resolve it, and I agree with that. You do not, because they will side in their favor, not your favor.
Yeah, and you got to look at too. You've got the old adage, don't count your chickens before they hatch. And we've been talking a lot about like your net profit. And one of the things you've got to kind of almost have insurance for, not only for taxes, right? Like not insurance, but like you need to be saving for taxes just in case. And then the other thing you should always kind of be prepared for is you may have some returns and you may have some things. We talked about that a little bit, but there are going to come times where you're just going to have to eat the cost. And you're like, you know what? I lost $100 because the customer lied and they shipped something back and it was broken and I tried to resolve and it didn't work. Sometimes it's easier just to say, this was the cost of doing business. And if you kind of factor that into your sales, if you're like, hey, I'm pulling in my 30-day total, my net profit in a month is, I don't know, $2,000. That's what I'm making net in a month. Well, I'm going to set aside a little bit of that and not spend it all and say like, well, I'm going to pull out X amount as my paycheck every month and X amount to buy more inventory. Well, set aside a little bit of that as like an just in case you have a month where you have a couple of instances like that where you're eating the cost on some items. So now you're out the cost that you initially paid for the item. Now you're out the cost of the shipping. Now you're out all of that. You can kind of just say like, okay, I've been putting aside for that and just count it as a business expense, right? You write that stuff off. And so you kind of have to be prepared for that and not count your chickens before they hatch and say, I mean, there's so many times where especially if it's a big item, I ship it out. I don't even count that as money I've made in my head until like 30 days later. Right? Like I want to, I mean, a lot of things, if it's bread and butter items, I don't care. But if it's like, hey, that was a $500 sale on that one item, I'm not going to go and pull that money out and start spending it on myself. Like, hey, I got a bonus this month. I'm going to wait a month because in case that customer wants to return it, I want to be able to resolve it and not have to stress out at like, I've already spent this money.
No, I agree. That's how I feel about the painting. Like I'm not counting it until the 30 days have passed. I like hear what San Antonio says. I'm like Walmart with returns. I accept all of them and keep it moving. It's not worth the headache in my opinion. I agree. Now it all depends. I think it's relative depending on how much it is, but generally like you got to accept returns. It's just the cost of doing business. All right, this next one here, sell-through rate. We haven't talked too much. We talk about this all the time, so we'll just keep it brief, but that's a number you need to pay attention to. I would say especially now. Okay. And what that is when you look up listings, okay, how many items are listed that are unsold and how many items are listed that are sold, right? And if it ends up being that you have the same amount, then you have a great sell-through rate. You're about 100%, right? So you want to make sure, but if you have a ton of items that are listed and only like one has sold in the last 90 days, guess what? It's going to take a long, long time for that item to sell, right? And it's going to bog your store down. It's going to tie up your money. You do not want to be in that place. So be aware of sell-through rate. It's, again, improving that slow moving inventory, maybe getting it out of your store, maybe clearancing it out is going to help you. And again, my perspective on this has changed over the last 6 months, but I do think this is the new direction eBay has gone. They do not want slow selling items on their platform. In the early years of the podcast, when we were doing interviews, one of our go-to interview questions, and pretty much every interview we ever did, was fast nickel or slow dime. Like, what is your method? Like, we'd ask people, and at the time we were very much on like the slow dime, right? Like just wait, like it doesn't, maybe this item sits for a couple of years. Like it's fine. Like if it's a good price, if I know that this is what people are paying for it, maybe there's not a lot of them listed. And we were big on that. And I remember the first time we had somebody on, I can't remember exactly who it was. And it was like husband and wife, and they did a lot of like travel resell as well. Oh yeah. They said, they were pretty much like everything we buy is done by that month. Like by the time that month is over, those items are sold. And we were like, man, that's really fast nickel. And at the time it seemed a little bit like shocking to us. Like, man, that's model. You could do that. But it just seems like you're leaving so much on the table. But as, like you said, Orlando, like as time has gone, we've kind of shifted to that, recognizing that,
you don't want a bunch of stale items bogging your store down. Now there are exceptions, right? Like you might have that like rare collectible item where it's like, hey, this is going to fetch $1,000, but it's probably going to take a couple years to find the right buyer. Maybe I have to drop it down to 800, but I'm not dropping this to 100 so I could sell it today. Like I'm going to wait a little bit. But if you can move a little bit closer to a faster sell-through rate, which kind of goes back to that custom SKU I gave, if you can get yourself to the point where you're like, hey, maybe I'm going to start within a year. Like by the end of, by the middle of next year when it's 2026, I don't want to see anything from 2025 still in my store. Right? Like if they're still in my store, that means my pricing is wrong. The sell-through rate on this was bad. I need to drop my pricing. I need it to move. Now, in order to do that effectively, and eventually if you can get down to like a 30-day, like, hey, the items coming into my store within 30 days, they're out, you have to be able to source as well. Like it's not just like, we'll just go get more items. Like you have to be able to source those types of items consistently. But if you can do that, you're going to be in a much better place if your store has lots of movement as opposed to it's slow, but when those sales come in, they're big, but it just takes forever.
Yeah, no, agreed. All right, and this last one here that we're going to talk about is ASP. People talk about ASP all the time, and it's average selling price, right? And everybody's different, right? There are some people that, hey, their average selling price is $20 and they're okay with that because they sell 100 widgets and they make $5 profit, and they do that every single day on 100 items. To them, it's worth it. And there's actually a guy, when I was in San Diego, we'd always go to the post office at the same time on Saturdays, and I'm pretty sure he was one of these guys that he had like low dollar items he was selling a ton of, but he was making good money. But you got to be aware of that. You have to be aware of your average sell price in the sense that, like you before, like Orlando, was it worth it paying all that promoted listings? Was it worth it paying all those fees? You're working double time to make the same amount of money, right? And you could end up in that trap if your average selling price is really low and you don't have great profit margins. You could be spending a ton of time. You may have high volume sales, but you may have low profit, and your average sell price is not worth it.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of comes down to, again, like your ability to source. We've given the toilet seat, analogy multiple times on this podcast. But honestly, like if I knew like, hey, I have a source where I can get 100 toilet seats a month, and I know I can sell 100 toilet seats a month, and I'm going to make $5 off of each, so it's $500, or I can make $8 each toilet seat I sell. So I'm going to make $800 a month, and I've already got all the boxes. It's going to be really easy. It's like, yeah, like the average sale price or your net profit on those items might be low, but it's like, if you can consistently do that, hey, like that's a gimme, right? Like I wouldn't say that has to be your whole model, but if you had one item like that where you can source consistently at a low price and sell and sell them in quantity, even if you've got a slim profit margin, it would work if you can do it in, sell in a much higher velocity like that. I think there is something to be said for that type of selling. Now, the same thing can be said when we talk about like the average sale price here. Maybe it's a low dollar item. Maybe it's not big like that. Maybe you're only making 25 cents an item. But if you could sell 500 of them every single month consistently, it ends up working out for you in your favor. Plus, going back, somebody asked here, how do I remove defects?
So there's three ways.
Okay, hold on. I'm gonna say real quick. So maybe you're lucky enough to get eBay to remove it, right? You work with the customer, you ask for them to remove, or you deal with eBay. But honestly, the biggest thing, and maybe Orlando's got some other things here, but is time and consistently selling more items, right? It's gonna get washed away. Things that have defects from today aren't gonna matter next year if you're not getting more defects between now and next year. So time and selling more items is going to, if you are sitting at a 10% defect rate and you sell another couple hundred items with no defects, that 10% defect rate can really quickly drop down to a 1% defect rate. So time and selling items are going to be your biggest things to really kind of wash those out.
No, I agree. And that is the best way. The best way is to be able to, just, dilute the percentage numbers, and it helps your transaction defect numbers go down. Now, you could also, there is seller support, and you can go to seller support. I challenge every shipping one because sometimes the post office does deliver things late and I miss it. So if you go to seller support and you go to request assistance, you can actually ask for some of them to be removed. They have updated a lot. eBay is done like now. It's like if you do not ship on time, they actually know. They actually track it. So be aware of that. But be careful with that. The other way is, you can call eBay but I would always recommend that is like your last resort, because they do track when you call, right? So if it's something that you've been selling for a long time and you haven't called for a long time, they may be willing to work with you. You know, if you say something to the effect of, it's been such a long time, I've always worked to, give great customer service. My feedback's at 100%. I'm a top rated seller. Maybe your concierge, and say, hey, is there any way I could make this resolved with a buyer? And if I can, is there any way you can help me out here? I just don't want it to bog down my store. Sometimes they are willing to work with you. So be aware of that. All right. Hey, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. I do want to address one last thing before we go. Somebody said, guys, what's up with that new podcast that stole your name? So I did find it. I went on podcast, like the Apple podcast. I'm like, I looked at Pure Hustle podcast. There is no Pure Hustle podcast, but there is a podcast called Pure Hustle. I really don't know what that they're about. I'm trying to even look at comments. I haven't caught an episode, but I don't know. Are they resellers? I don't know. I'm interested. I don't know. It doesn't look like they're resellers. I think they're just talking about stuff.
Yeah, we are the OG Pure Hustlers.
I know.
For real.
It's okay.
We should have trademarked it. We should have trademarked everything related to. We should have trademarked the initials PHP.
You know what? We own all the domain names. So if they want to buy it for a nice, healthy amount of $1 million, we will sell the domain name. There you go. So, anyways, hey, thank you everyone that tuned in. We did trademark Pure House, I believe we did. But anyways, that's a whole other conversation. Hand LOL. I don't know what that means, secondhand solo. But anyways, on that note, we're gonna end it. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you for always supporting Pure Hustle Podcast. Make sure to hit that like button. If you're not subscribed, make sure to subscribe. Thank you everyone for just being an incredible audience that tunes in every week. I look forward to having you all on the podcast next week. And with that being said, make sure to be real,
Be relevant.
and be reselling. Lates.
Peace.